please join me in welcoming Sam, a veritable Renaissance man of all things liberty and economics, Sam Staley.
All right, thank you very much for having me. This is actually a great opportunity to for me, just talk about something I really love, but also don't have many opportunities to talk about. So, and I think it's the topic of liberty in Hollywood. It's actually a very dynamic environment in which we're in right now, and I'm going to hopefully give you a little bit of insight into, at least from some of my observations of looking at this particular topic. And also, I think will come through in this presentation, I am cautiously optimistic about where Hollywood will go. But of course, we were starting so low in terms of liberty. To be able to get some sort of movement forward is a win in that way, in one way. A little bit more, just real quickly, you might just so that I do work at Florida State University. We're a university with 40,000 students. I am full-time faculty, work in the DeVoe Center, which is a free market think tank in a public university with an endowment, which is a bit odd. But I've been using that platform to really strengthen the free market movement among the student body. And my own calculations, back of the envelope, are that we probably have a small liberal arts college of conservatives and libertarians that on our campus. And that has given me a lot of scope to look into other aspects of popular culture that a faculty member wouldn't normally have. In my office, I actually have a "Don't Tread on Me" flag flying on the wall. And this group might appreciate that. Also, I'm faculty advisor at the College Republicans, Young Americans for Freedom, Turning Point, and a number of others. And so a lot of what we try to do is provide support to young people who are in the conservative and libertarian side of the political spectrum. And there's a lot there I think we can be encouraged by as well. And if you have questions, I'm going to leave time for Q&A. I'm open to giving you any thoughts if you might have questions on that at that time too. All right, but I'm here to talk about the future of liberty in Hollywood. If I were giving this talk 5 years ago, I would have been much more skeptical of what's happening with liberty than I am now, and I'm going to talk a little bit of why that's true. And as James said, I've written a book on sort of film, contemporary film and economics. Now, as an economist, most economists do take a market-oriented approach to looking at the way the world works. Even those that are liberal still kind of work within a market framework. Of course, I am a free market economist, and I'm wearing my tie that says freedom on it, which if you want to look at, it's awesome. This was actually given to me by David Thoreau, who's the president of the Independent Institute in California. And it's David, who's married to Mary Garvey Thoreau, who I've known for years, and he has actually given me a platform to write movie reviews from a liberty perspective, and I've been doing that pretty regularly. And now have about 130 published movie reviews, several that I've chosen not to review simply because I don't have time, because it's not my full-time job. But as I was doing those reviews, and what triggered this in working with the Independent Institute is that I was beginning to see these liberty themes and these economic themes that are probably not even designed by the directors and producers and screenwriters. Because economics is really about life. At the end of the day, we're trying to understand why people make the decisions they do every day. What incentives do they face? What are the benefits and what are the costs? And how does that play out in movies? And so I began to look at that more intentionally with a little bit more rigor, and then pitched a book to Rutledge, which is out of London, on contemporary film and economics, and they picked up on it, and I'm very grateful for that. But it really started with a free market think tank that was actually kind of interested in these weird musings I would have about the movie itself. But the other part of it is what's different about my movie reviews, and if you're on Facebook, you can go to @themovieswithsam, and you can actually like my page, and you'll get them all, is that I don't just look at the artistic quality of the movie, I look at the content. So when I see a movie that's actually misrepresenting economics, I actually comment on that in my movie review. If I find a review that is pro-liberty that might not be quite, we might not normally see, that will be part of my review. So recently I just reviewed Little Women, which is about it's the novel from the 19th century, and there are actually some interesting liberty themes that are embedded in the plot that I don't think a lot of people would pick up on. And so those are the kinds of things I do at the Independent Institute. I also write more conventional reviews because I just figure if I've watched the movie, I might as well write something about it. So do that. But I want to talk today a little bit more specifically, intentionally about some of these movies. I think a couple things that are important for understanding Hollywood. First of all, Hollywood is crony capitalist. There is no principle at all that drives other than what is the profit bottom line of Hollywood. And so at the end of the day, if there are movies that are making money, they will produce them. There's no moral compass. There's no real sense of ethics. It is a brutal industry to be involved in. And to some extent, the people that are involved in the industry are self-selecting into that kind of a real pragmatic industry. And so that has good and bad things. Bad things is that if you have a lot of liberals that are making films, as long as they're going to make money, they're going to continue to produce those films. The good news is if you actually get films that are actually talking about liberty and are doing well commercially, they will produce those as well. At the end of the day, it's about the green. And the other thing is, and the part of the problem is that in Hollywood, it's really populated by creatives, people that are really trying to think outside the box and do different things. So most of the media platforms are dominated by liberals and progressives. I could say a few uncharitable things about liberals and progressives and creatives, but I don't think that would be very helpful. But for the most part, creative people tend to be very liberal, socially liberal in particular, but in ways that we don't always appreciate that in some ways can actually benefit liberty. And I'll talk a little bit about that. The other part of the problem is if you are conservative in Hollywood, you want to pay your bills. And so if it makes sense for you to keep your head down and just go do your job, if you can pay your bills, then you'll do that. So it's a liberal environment. Most conservatives are fearful of their jobs and their ability to work. I think it's a lot more complicated than many people think, but you don't have a lot of visibility for conservative ideas in Hollywood. I know this is becoming really even more pessimistic, but I'm going to show some optimism here in a few minutes. Part of the problem is that conservatives don't know how to talk to liberals. And so the dialogue and the conversation in Hollywood isn't really suited to producing a lot of conservative content because we just don't know how to talk about it. Now, I can talk a little bit more about that. I'm not going to spend a lot tonight. But essentially, with the way I look at my job at FSU, even though we have 1,600 students that are in conservative libertarian organizations, my job is really to talk to liberals and progressives because that's where my students are. That's where their value system starts. By the way, I do a pretty good job of converting them to free markets. That's another topic in conversation. So there's a lot of potential that we have not even begun to tap. But at the end of the day, the way I do that is if I'm talking to a liberal or a progressive, I don't come in and talk about Ayn Rand because that's just not going to get anywhere. What I will talk about is how markets and entrepreneurship empower people and how they give them an opportunity to create resources that allow them to be independent, and that becomes a way that they can be actualized as a human being. And that goes a long way. And in fact, that is a fundamental principle of some of the courses I teach, is we start with human dignity and we show how limited government supports that. Okay, but the problem is there's not much of a conversation in Hollywood because no one really knows how to talk about this. The other thing is that for a long time, not so much the actors and the producers, but conservatives just don't understand film. Film is a very specific medium, and it carries a very specific structure. What it is all about is visual storytelling. It's not me getting up and lecturing and providing tables of data. It is about trying to bring someone else's story and connect with the audience in a very visceral level. In other words, you're looking at the actor or the actress and you're saying, either I can be that person, I know someone who's like that, and I can envision myself in that environment, and that story is what connects. So storytelling, conservatives, until very recently, simply didn't understand storytelling and how important that is in terms of communicating values. And that has changed. And I think this is probably the biggest shift over the last, I say 5 years, maybe 10 years. But I've seen the manifestation of that in the last 3 or 4 years, which is why I'm optimistic. And I want to talk a little bit about that. So a little bit about Hollywood and sort of movies themselves. First of all, message movies, whether they're left or right, generally don't sell. It's really hard to get audiences in to a movie that is what I call a message movie. That's one where the primary purpose of the movie is to promote a particular message or a particular value. People don't want to be lectured. When they go into a movie theater, they want to be entertained. And they want to have something that they can connect to. And this is what the problem was with Atlas Shrugged, the movies. And I've seen all 3 of the movies. And when I'm looking at it, it's a faithful adaptation to the extent that you can adapt a huge book into the narrative structure of a film. It's pretty faithful. But that's a problem. That's why that's not a good movie, because at the end of the day, there's an awful lot of lecturing in Atlas Shrugged. I think there's one, I think, 100-page lecture on economics that's actually part of the dialogue of the novel. They couldn't do that on film, but they're carrying the same kind of tone, the same kind of message. And the problem with narrative films is you have to engage audience on a very emotional level. You have to speak to the human experience, but a lot of what Ayn Rand's novel is about trying to talk about heroic actions of characters that are not always multidimensional. It's hard for me. Dagny Taggart I can relate to. Franco d'Anconia, maybe not so much. I'm not going to be a pillar of industry. I'm not actually running railroads. I'm actually trying to work with a lot of squirrely 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds, which is a different thing altogether. But the movies, they can promote the core values, but if the message is the primary focus and the story is not, they won't do well. I've seen lots of left-wing movies flop. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why one movie in the theaters now is flopping, which it is left-wing, which should be a left-wing movie, but why it's flopping, at least in my viewpoint. And so the key then, if you really want something about messages, do documentaries. They are actually, that is the format you want to use. And I'm not going to talk so much about documentaries, and don't underestimate documentaries, by the way, particularly when we're in short format, which I mean is like 10 minutes or 12 minutes. Those are very powerful. I can tell you from my students, the primary way they like to consume information is through video. And they read documentaries. They watch documentaries. They watch TED Talks. They watch a lot of these short films that institutes are producing, and if you do them well, you will communicate those ideas. But it's more like reading a nonfiction book. It's not about entertainment. It's about learning how an idea is taking hold someplace. And so part of the problem is that we've had, for a long time, amateur filmmakers making amateur movies. One of my favorites is this movie called AmeriGhen. I don't know if anybody here see this movie? There's a reason for it. It's terrible. Which is interesting because the producer and primary finance, actually I think it was someone in the oil industry that financed it, but it was actually produced by Chuck Norris. Now, Chuck Norris is a very successful television actor and a film actor. So when I went into this, I thought, finally we have someone who understands film who's actually going to make a good movie. Well, it's a terrible movie. And the reason it's terrible is because the characters are 2D. You're either evil or you're good. It's trying to set up a plot that is very much on the fringe. And actually it says, they've taken our country, it's time to take it back. That's how they marketed it. Okay, so who are the villains? How many of us believe that North Korea is actually going to take over the United States? Well, they're the villains, right? And the Mexicans. All right, so the plausibility of the plot itself was a problem. Then when you layer in the fact that the story is really very simplistic, there's not a lot of, most of us are three-dimensional. I know my kids made me very three-dimensional very fast when they were growing up, and I still think that way, and it just didn't connect to people. So the movie itself didn't work. In order to impact culture, which I'm really interested in doing, We do need a broad message, one that's universal, and we need something that people can buy into as part of their normal everyday life. And narrative film is not a policy recommendation. This is a huge difference. So there were, in AmeriGhen, they were trying to argue that the deep state had taken over the government. We may believe that, but in terms of actually trying to translate it, actually the way it comes off as a conspiracy theorist who really is off the rocker. If you want to make that point, you can't do it in narrative film because that is not the right venue to do it. And most people, and if you want broad audience, people aren't going to listen to it. You may be able to get your friends who believe that to watch it, but you're not actually going to influence broad culture. And I think about narrative film, I think about trying to influence culture. For the most part, and by the way, I've been in this movement for a long time. I started my first free market think tank in 1989. Ideologues like to lecture. And I am an academic. Believe me, I love to lecture. I mean, that's sort of what I do. You give me, well, if we had 5 hours, I'd figure out a way to fill it up, all right? The problem is you guys would be all asleep. In fact, in about 5 minutes, half of you will be asleep. So the problem is that films are terrible when they lecture. People don't go into a movie to be lectured to. That's not what it's part about. And also the other part of the problem is, I think it's important, is we tend to believe our own press. I am sure Chuck Norris thought this was a great movie. I have no doubt about it. I'm sure that whoever put the $10 or $15 million into that movie to produce it thought it was a great movie. I think it was true for Ayn Rand. They thought that it was an important movie. They thought it was a good movie. But they really did fall flat. They didn't find an audience, and it really didn't affect broad culture the way I think the ideas that underlie those films could actually do, the way under its potential. So what are the movies that seem to make, what makes a good movie? Again, a good movie, a good narrative film is going to hit a broad audience. It's not going to be a narrow niche movie. It has to connect to the audience. I already talked about that. This is something that we're still learning. You have to have complex characters. Most of us in life don't come into life always faced with yes and no answers. We have a lot of gray area. And then we make judgment calls. And sometimes they're right. Hopefully most of the times they're right. Hopefully most of the times they're right. Sometimes they're wrong. Flawed characters are an important part of telling a good story. And so complex characters are important. The more you default into simplistic good versus bad, evil versus good, the movies themselves begin to fall flat. It also needs to be forward moving. In other words, what that means is you have to feel engaged the entire time. You have to think that you're actually moving in the movie and in the story. And another part is something that's very important. It's called the hero's journey. In other words, what happens is the hero, first thing they try to do is they run into it, they have the normal world. You have come to the College Republican, or not the College Republican, but the Pachyderm Club, right? And you have certain expectations about what's going to happen. And then what happens is something challenges that. I come up and start talking about how important progressivism is and how all you guys are wrong. Now, the hero, you guys, would then, the first thing you're going to do is going to react. And the first thing most people do, and this is human psychology, is we try to use all the stuff we did in the past to try and correct that problem with the old tools, the old ways of thinking about it. You'll challenge the progressive, you'll challenge me and say, you don't really understand human action. You don't understand the way markets work. You don't understand the importance of profits. But of course, I'm a progressive, so I'm just going to say, well, you don't understand people. You're not human. You don't understand the human condition. And then, so what happens is the hero has to then say, okay, if I really want to communicate, most of you just walk out on me, maybe, but if you really did want to try and communicate with me, you need a new tool. You would have to challenge those old assumptions. And then maybe what you would do is you'd shift your language. You would say to the progressive, well, if you really want to help the most marginalized people in society, don't you think we should empower them? Should we give them an ability to start their own business? Why are we getting in the way of starting their own business? So the hero's journey is where that person begins to use new tools. And then ultimately, we want to be entertained, so the hero has to win. So I have to, at the end of this, say, you're right, I shouldn't be a progressive. I should be a Republican. And then, so evil, there is this climactic point. But in all cases, the characters are forced to make big decisions in a good story. The stakes have to be high. And so that's what makes a good story. And actually, you'll see this not only in filmmaking and screenwriting, but this is fairly well established. Now, the other part of my story is that I'm a novelist. So I'm interested, I've got 6 novels out. And so I learned about storytelling as I was crafting these novels and failing on my first one and figuring out how to make it work. And just so they knew, I have written a feature-length screenplay, but it's not been unproduced. Why? Because of this. So I've actually applied these criteria to my own work as well. Art house and industry audiences are very different. These are sort of Atlas Shrugged. It's kind of an industry, it's a niche audience. You might be able, it's not intended for broad audiences. This is where this is really the intention of trying to create an artistic film, something that's going to maybe break from convention. Artistic films are about not only breaking from convention, they also like being dark. And there are a couple movies out I might talk about a little bit later. And that's because artists really like to go to dark places because they think that challenges the human condition. But honestly, most of us don't want to go and come out of the movie theater and be really depressed, so they don't do well. By the way, they don't get big budgets either. There's a reason why Marvel movies have $150, $200 million budgets, because they can make it back, because at the end of the day, you're going to feel good about it. The art houses are on $5 million budgets, $10 million budgets, and they're just hoping they might get some of it out of it, but not always even that. Sometimes it's just to establish the reputation in the industry as artists. Stories are very specific to circumstances. In other words, most of us in this room most people will not relate to the story itself because it's, again, narrow audience. And they are, however, movies that do grapple with really big ideas about systems, about how people are in the world. So these are 2 very different things, very different types of films. So what makes a movie commercially successful? This is a good one. So this movie is out in the movie theaters right now, Bombshell. It's about the sexual harassment case, sexual harassment that was actually happening in Fox News under Roger Ailes, who was a brilliant media strategist, but was really not a very good person to work for. And it's an interesting case because it's doing very poorly at the box office. And I am sure that the folks that developed this, because we have Charlize Theron, we have Nicole Kidman, Margot Robbie, who's an amazing actress, probably one of our most gifted young actresses now, produced by Charlize Theron, who's a major actor, one of the producers. Pretty big budget, $30 million, I think. So for a movie like this, a drama, it's pretty decent size. This movie was made to make money. This movie was not made because they thought it was going to be an art house film that was going to only travel outside the multiplexes, but it's bombing. So Bombshell is bombing in the bad way and it's also riding the wave of an important social issue, which is sexual harassment in the workplace. I do believe this is an issue. I do think Fox News had a toxic culture. I believe if you were a woman working in Fox News, it was very difficult to actually do well and feel good about yourself because of the nature of the culture that was created. But those are human resources management issues. But in the area, at this particular moment in time, the thought was, well, here's a story we can tell about sexual harassment in the workplace, and it will resonate with a broad audience. We have A-list producers, A-list directors, A-list actors and actresses. John Lithgow is Roger Ailes, an incredible performance. Charlize Theron's performance is incredible, really well acted, but it's bombing. So, first of all, it's not clear anybody really knows why some films are successful or not. I've done some of the statistics myself. I've read lots of studies. What we do find is that word of mouth is incredibly important. So one reason this is not doing well is because the word of mouth on the movie is that it's not a very good movie. And it's not just conservatives, it's actually liberals and progressives that are also saying that. Distribution is critical, but this clearly had a lot of distribution. It probably opened at about 1,500 movie theaters, maybe 2,000 or more. I haven't looked at the numbers. It went into wide release. And what we do know from research is that movie critics can hurt movies commercially, but they can't help them. If you have a good movie and a good word of mouth, it's going to do well regardless of what the critics say. The critics can do as much as they want to write positively about a movie, but if it doesn't have good word of mouth, it doesn't seem to matter. What they can do is come out the box, and I'm going to talk about this in the context of another movie here pretty soon. If it's really bad word of mouth, it can actually hurt a movie at the box office. Very difficult for them to recover. Did not get great reviews. But what it did do is, I thought at this time, meaning literally this time at 12:30 on this day or yesterday, I have a very lengthy review that's going to go up at the Independent Institute that analyzes Bombshell and why it's not working. At the end of the day, I think what happens is this became a movie and a story about Hollywood elites and powerful people going after powerful people. It did not connect to people on the ground level. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is that Megyn Kelly, who I actually am a fan of, I can't relate to her because I don't make tens of millions of dollars, and there she's circulating in a world I can't even think about how that would work. And so, so she's going after Roger Ailes, and Roger Ailes I think may be a really lecherous human being, but at the end of the day, why do I care? Because it doesn't affect me. So, and when we're trying to connect to broad audiences, that's important. Margot Robbie's character, on the other hand, is a character that should relate on a broad level. The problem is they really designed the character in a way that makes it very hard for us to relate. She's conservative, so that's good, and she is very much committed to doing conservative journalism on television, which is good. The movie actually does a fairly good job of not going after conservatism. It actually is focused on the sexual harassment component. But so you've got a 20-something young journalist, very charismatic, very ambitious, the kind of person that I want my daughter to be, and then she immediately enters into a gay relationship. What's that all about? I mean, you basically just eliminated most of your audience to that point because the gay community is only 5% of the American population, and it's not growing. So they immediately ended up moving the story in a direction that very few people could relate to. And frankly, as someone who actually does pay attention a lot to sexual harassment on campus as well as elsewhere, the movie just is flat. There just really isn't any momentum to the movie. But anyway, hopefully that'll be up in the next day or two. But let's go to some good news. Good news. This is a movie, The Free State of Jones, Matthew McConaughey, not exactly known as a conservative. As far as I can tell, none of the producers of the movies are conservative or pro-liberty. It's a story about a county in Mississippi that seceded from Mississippi during the Civil War over slavery. Because Mississippi was trying to keep slavery, the people in this county said, we want to eliminate slavery. And it is interesting because of the dynamic between whites and blacks and trying to preserve that. And they actually seceded because they thought the Union Army was going to come in and protect them, and they didn't. But the interesting thing is that in this is a very pro-liberty message on gun rights, because blacks, in order to vote, needed to be protected because otherwise they were facing serious lynching. And there's an interesting scene where a free black man is trying to register other blacks to vote, and he is lynched. So when they are allowed to vote, it's because Matthew McConaughey takes his gun in and says, look, you better let them vote. If you don't, I'll shoot you. Pretty strong stuff, and it's actually based on reality. And so this is a real person that did this. And so that was in there. So the question is why? Because it made a good story, for one. But the other, it's intriguing. It's sort of thinking about how does that work. Also, the other thing we seem to forget, a lot of liberals don't like authoritarian government. The problem is they don't realize that government is authoritarian. However, every once in a while, you'll get, this movie, I think it's out of theaters now. You can probably get it on Amazon Prime or Netflix. But Motherless Brooklyn, actually, it may still be in theaters because I think it may have actually been nominated for an award. This is Ed Norton, who is a actor, producer, director, very much an art house guy. Fight Club is the movie he's most well known for, but very much a liberal. But Motherless Brooklyn is a film noir, which means it's dark, and it's a crime thriller, or maybe thriller, maybe definitely crime drama. And it's about a kid, an orphan whose raised in Manhattan with Tourette's syndrome and actually is hired by a private investigator as one of his investigators. Now, played by Bruce Willis. Bruce Willis's character is killed, and so this new the character that Ed Norton plays is trying to solve that crime. Now, the important thing is this is a crime drama. This has nothing to do with policy. It has nothing to do with political philosophy. However, this is the thing that I thought was really interesting as I was watching it. It's set in the 1950s Manhattan. Ed Norton changes the story from the novel to focus on urban renewal in Manhattan, which is being used by crony capitalists to evict people so that they can redevelop housing for their own purposes. The entire theme is around how people use the government for their own ends and against the public interest. And so there are two things. One is what's happening to the people, the renters, that were mainly African American, by the way, urban renewal is also called Negro renewal for a reason. We see that urban renewal in many cities was in fact going not only after the low-income neighborhoods, but also the ones that were African American because they didn't have as much power in the structure in government itself. But the other part of it is that the villain is a guy named Robert Moses. Now, Robert Moses in the 1930s and 1940s and 50s and 60s was called the power broker because he knew how all the people in government what they needed to do to get what he wanted done. He's the one that got the highways built through New York and bulldozed neighborhoods through New York, almost bulldozed Greenwich Village as part of those projects, but was actually stopped from grassroots activism. And Robert Moses, by all accounts, was a ruthless power broker. And at one point, his political connections allowed him to be on 11 different civic boards, parks, highways and roads, housing, all so that he could use his connections to achieve this kind of effect. That is built into this movie. So Ed Norton, who has done his research, understands what was happening in Manhattan at the time, understands urban renewal, actually built that into a story. Why? Because it was about authority. And it was about how authority was being used to keep average people down and trying to keep them out of the system. So these are things that we don't normally think about, but these are progressives and these are liberals that actually are willing to think about these themes and how they actually build them into the storytelling, and it works. Another movie which is much more, I don't know if anybody's seen Joy. This was Jennifer Lawrence. This is about Joy Mangano, who came up with the Miracle Mop. And it was a huge financial success. She's, I think, got over 300 patents to her name right now. This is really a biopic, a beautiful story of someone who came from nothing and became one of the most successful female entrepreneurs in American history. And very well done. Hollywood loves heroes. This is a great hero. The movie did well at the box office. Again, we have the hero. We have all the elements of a good movie in this as well. Again, no one that I can tell really was trying to make this movie as a conservative movie or as a libertarian movie. It's talking about the hero. It's talking about overcoming obstacles. It's talking about the human dignity and doing it in a market, in an economic context. So commercial films that do well, in fact, can have liberty themes. Our task is to figure out how to get them to be more prevalent. Good news, and I'm going to probably wrap this up in a few minutes. I want to put a couple movies on your radar screen, but then I want to leave about 15 minutes for some questions you might have. So I've got about 3 more minutes. Couple movies that have come out that have been very helpful. I believe Little Pink House. It's about eminent domain, Suzette Kilo. I think this is a breakthrough movie for Hollywood development because Ted and Courtney Balaker. Courtney is the director and the writer of this. Institute for Justice is the public interest litigation group that actually supported Suzette Kilo. A little bit of truth in at least I actually helped draft an amicus brief in favor of Suzette Kilo as a Reason Foundation. Didn't really know what was going on at the time, and then afterwards, this was the most important property rights case of the last 30 years. And the reason is because the Supreme Court actually ruled against Suzette Kilo and in favor of the city. So what the movie is doing is showing why essentially that was the wrong decision because of what it did to Suzette Kelo, but doing it in the context of the human story. What was government doing in this context? Now, there's a positive element of the story because it set off a nationwide reform effort on eminent domain, to rein in eminent domain. So there's that element. But what Courtney and Ted understood is that in order to get something as boring as eminent domain to be paid attention to by the average person, they had to make it a story. And they had to find a protagonist, someone who was going to go through their hero's journey. And Suzette Kelo did in real life. They adapted it to the screen. And so I think this was a threshold movie. Avoids the pitfalls of being ideological. In fact, if you're paying attention to it, there's a social justice theme that comes right out of it. Like, this is wrong. We shouldn't have the government actually trying to put people that are low income, have very few resources, that we shouldn't try to keep them down as part of that. So she is very much an everyday, she's an EMT paramedic, so she's not wealthy. And a lot of people can connect to that working class background. So story's focus is also on the one woman's fight. It is about big ideas, but the big ideas are captured in the story, not someone lecturing somebody about what that is. Another important film, I think, is Miss Virginia. This is about the fight for school choice in Washington, D.C. This came out last summer. Again, most of us in this room probably understand the importance, or at least are willing to accept that school choice is important. As parents, we want to be able to send our kids to the best school possible or homeschool them if we want. Most people don't have that option. Miss Virginia Walden Ford, is the one who in Washington, D.C. led the effort to get privately and publicly funded school vouchers in Washington, D.C. Does the same thing. Definitely worth watching. Again, they do the storytelling right. It's one woman's fight to provide a good education for her child. She tries to go the normal way, but working through the system, talking to her elected officials, they don't get anywhere. She then realizes she has to fight the establishment, and she overcomes that. This is a nice positive story because she actually gets that done. I want to talk really briefly about Christian movies. Man, the quality has really improved over the last 5 or 10 years. Unplanned is a very sophisticated story about abortion, about one woman's conversion from being pro-choice. Well, actually, she wasn't pro-choice, but she kind of was working within the world. She was actually a director of a Planned Parenthood clinic, and then she had a moral and ethical conversion, which was very, very powerful. Their focus is on that, but what they don't do in this, they don't demonize the pro-choice people. They treat them as human beings. And that is really important because that opens up this story to a much broader audience. We're not just talking to the anti-abortion folks or the anti-choice folks, or whatever we want to call them, the pro-life. We're actually talking to a broader audience, which means this movie can be used to foster discussions about this issue, which is actually a critical issue. A little bit more focused. Now, let me conclude, and there are a lot of other things in here, but I'm pretty much talked about them in one way or the other. I want to talk about, has anyone here seen Richard Jewell? 2 people, 3? It's about the Olympic Park bombing, and Richard Jewell was the one who found the bomb, and then he was pilloried by the press because the FBI made him his primary witness. It's an incredible story. Clint Eastwood directed it, produced by a lot of A-list producers. Clint Eastwood is conservative. He does movies that are perceived as being conservative, but it is a fine movie. It is a really, really good movie. I want to end this because one, we have top actors. Kathy Bates is in it, does a fantastic job. Actually, all the actors do a great job. Clint Eastwood has really crafted a great story. It's a great film. What's interesting is how the media hijacked this movie. And it's very clear when you look at it. What happened, this is what I was talking about, how bad press can actually affect the performance in the theater. But it wasn't the film critics that hijacked it. It was the mainstream media that hijacked it, because they made a claim about how a character, one of their own, is projected in the film, which is incorrect, but nevertheless carried a lot of the narrative. They lost control of the narrative in the public debate. Essentially, they made this movie about how Clint Eastwood maligned a member of the press unfairly. The movie is about Richard Jewell being facing the injustice of being pilloried for something he didn't do. And then what does that mean for the bigger issues about media, about FBI investigations? In terms of movies based on true events, this is actually pretty accurate. In other words, there's one scene in there where they lure Richard Jewell into an interrogation by telling him they're actually doing a documentary that's going to highlight how people can work with authorities to help an investigation. It is a fabrication, a lie, and but that really happened. That is an actual tactic the FBI used. Didn't tell him he was under investigation, didn't tell him that, but he was smart enough to realize, this doesn't quite fit. And he called his lawyer, and they pressured him to, this is just a documentary. So now I want to talk to my lawyer. So Richard Jewell is, again, someone who is not wealthy, has very few resources, having trouble keeping a job, probably has a bit of a complex in wanting to be in law enforcement, but at the same time, he's smart. And what Clint Eastwood has done with the screenplay is shown that intelligence of an average person that many people can connect to. And so it's a really powerful movie. But it was hijacked by the media because they didn't like the narrative of a particular part of the film, plus they didn't like Clint Eastwood anyway because he's a conservative. So, one of the columns I read, remember, this is the director who talked to a chair at the Republican National Convention. What does that have to do with the movie? Nothing, right? And unfortunately, the movie's not doing well at the box office, and I think that's a big chunk of it. It's because they lost control of the narrative. So, and when we're thinking about where Hollywood is going, one, we have the stories on the conservative libertarian end. We have the stories. It's a question about becoming part enough of the establishment that these stories can be made into film. We're doing much better. Little Pink House, Miss Virginia are good examples, but these are still films that are probably in the $5 to $10 million budget range. We need to be able to get these into the $25 and $30 million budget range, because then you have the production values, then you have the access to the distribution systems, then you can begin these things to become mainstream. But we can't get there without the movies we have. This is a building block. I am cautiously optimistic. Movies do not shift people's ideological perspective, but they can reinforce them if they're done well. So I love what the Liberty Movement is doing with film. I think it's great. I'm personally very pleased because I love to be able to go into and watch a movie and say, my values are being represented. Yeah. At the same time, I appreciate good movies, even when they don't, as well, but that's more of an art appreciation as opposed to a values-based appreciation. And let me stop here. I actually went further than I wanted to, but if there are some questions or comments.
Okay, we've got some hands up.
All right, yep.
Oh, yeah. Here in Wichita and Sedgwick County, we've spent about $1 billion over the last decade in urban renewal, got nothing for it. Who do we contact about getting that movie made?
Yeah, now that's actually a really good question for this. Now, Motherless Brooklyn is not a movie, and it's not advertised as being about urban renewal. So the way you would do that is you need a good story. What's the human impact of this? In other words, I'm an urban economist. I can cite numbers of billions of dollars and hundreds of people removed. But what makes Motherless Brooklyn powerful is the character that they're talking about. What makes Little Pink House work and Miss Virginia work is they're focusing on the human aspect of that policy. So if what you can do is find someone or someone's story, it can be historical or contemporary, who was meaningfully negatively impacted by that, you have the core of a good story. It's going to be tough because they may not have been able to reverse urban renewal, But if what you're able to do is show that they still persisted as humans and were able to make their life powerful and important from that experience, you've got a good movie. And it doesn't have to be in LA and it doesn't have to be Chicago. It can be Wichita. So it's a question of having a good story, good script, and then having a lot of patience to try and work through the system, because it's hard to get a movie actually produced. Yeah.
Thank you again for coming. I commented basically about Christian movies. Can you talk about the Kendrick made movies? You've seen any of those you want to talk about?
Kendrick. So, and that I'm assuming is the producer or the. Unfortunately, I can't because I don't remember names very well. So is there
Overcomer, courageous, overcomer, courageous.
overcome
Overcomer.
I've heard of it, but I didn't see it.
Overcomer's the cross country.
Yeah. Okay.
Phenomenally cross country. It's
Right.
much deeper than
Yeah.
that. War Room, courageous is kind of a cop movie.
Okay.
Fireproof is a firefighter.
Yeah. Haven't seen those, so I can't really comment on them. What I can do, and I am making more of an effort to watch more Christian movies. I'm actually happen to have a theater that I go to regularly that does project those that has those movies. But what they're doing is it's not about being Christian as it is about the human journey that people go through. The movie that I think has probably changed a lot of people's perceptions about this, about Christianity and about what those movies can be is, I think it's called Breakthrough, which is about a kid who fell through the ice. And it was their faith that actually what held the community together as this child was going through the coma that comes from breaking through the ice and that type of thing. Very, very well done. Very, very well reviewed by mainstream critics as well. And again, what it's done, it's not me going in with my sermon. It's saying, as a Christian, that my faith is important and that helps me connect with other people. And I do believe that there's something bigger out there than me. And as I commit to that, and I go full faith, and I'm fully committed to that I become better as a result of that, no matter what trauma I'm being faced with right now. And so I'm really excited about where Christian filmmaking is going based on what I've been seeing in the theaters. And again, that movie went into wide release. Yeah. Yep.
I was wondering what you thought about those Dinesh D'Souza movies.
Yeah.
I thought they were very well done, but apparently they just attracted a niche audience.
Yeah. So the Dinesh D'Souza movies they've done very well, but they tend to be, the ones I'm familiar with are fact-based nonfiction. They're not narrative film. The problem is that they're really catering to an existing audience. So I think they're great in terms of if we go to those movies, we see a lot of stuff we see and we understand, and so we sort of trigger. And it's important. We're just happy that someone's talking about it. But in terms of reaching a broader audience, documentary films and generally don't reach broad audiences, and that's what I'm finding with. He's doing better than who's the left wing, Michael Moore. Michael Moore. He's doing better than Michael Moore, which is great. But Michael Moore's not getting to a lot of people either. He's just getting a lot of press, and then he's making a decent amount at the box office and other venues that allow him to make money and keep doing it. So to me, the one reason I like the narrative is because I'm really thinking about how are we getting to 50 million people, 75 million people through the first couple weekends. There were more people that watched The Hunger Games in its opening weekend than had read the books over the previous 4 years of the trilogy. So huge in terms of potential influence.
Samuel, since you teach millennials, young people,
Yep.
Last night you commented about millennials, the free market. Are we looking at the positive things for these young people?
Oh yeah, I am so encouraged by millennials and Gen Z, which is the ones after that. In part, by the way, they love this film. They love film and video. That's where they're learning a lot. So that's part of it. But the other part of it is that they are entrepreneurial, and they understand the importance of human dignity, and they are looking for realistic and practical ways to empower people. And they understand and are open to, and they understand that markets and entrepreneurship can do that. I work with that every day, and I actually have a series of courses where I'm kind of converting leftist students to free market capitalism over 15 weeks. I'm using many of the same principles that I've been talking about here in terms of narrative film, but in the context of an actual building a business and showing how that happens. So I'm very encouraged, but we have to talk the right way. We have to actually communicate the right values. We have to talk about our ideas in ways that connect with this current generation. They will work hard. They work hard for me. They will work hard for other people, but they are different. They are different. They've got a different set of attitudes, a different set of values that comes from the privilege of being a generation that has grown up with a lot of wealth. But they are very willing to look, they can be very reflective and can really be quite amazing people. So I love working with them.
Dr. Sam Staley.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are adjourned. Have a great weekend and stay dry.